Chapter 10. Why You Aren't Just Your Brain. Reductionism is the belief that observing the smallest parts that make up matter will allow us to explain everything else. This ideology is an inversion of an earlier one in which all things emanate from a single, all-connected source called the monad. Using the monad, the most abstract conception of God, religions and mystical traditions have sought to explain all existence from the top down. Until recently, scientists and engineers have explained things from the bottom up. As science has progressed, it has been discovered that the smallest things, particles, cannot be so easily reduced. Electrons and photons do not always behave separately, displaying mind-boggling entanglements with each other that belie our understanding of them as separate objects. Though it had a precursor in ancient Greek atomism, reductionism became all the rage with the marvel of clockwork. Life started to be compared with machines. Animals began to be explained as if they were robotic automatons. Nowadays, this metaphor has developed for the computer age, and we are often compared to computers with robot bodies. Our brains are described as mere processors, and the entirety of our personalities, thoughts, feelings, and memories merely a result of an operating system running in our skull. Many people ponder if a personality could be downloaded as data to a computer, or if a computer could, given the right sequence of ones and zeros, gain conscious self-awareness, or even a soul. The more fervent of the transhumanists can hardly wait for a new bodiless age where personalities live in a digital cloud and can be downloaded into a variety of human or robot bodies. The implications of this are highly dualistic, like a kind of sci-fi Gnosticism. The body is thought to be something that restricts, an imperfection that prevents us from reaching the potential of pure mind or spirit. If we were pure spirit or pure information, then we could be boundless and free. Wouldn't that be nice? No? These science fiction fantasies send us down the wrong track. When we restrict our studies of consciousness and perception to the brain, we end up asking the wrong questions, and that has painted the scientific study of consciousness into a corner, now popularly termed the hard problem. I propose that the pragmatic magical approach we have been exploring in this book can help us to see these issues. And I will attempt to reframe the question of consciousness and the mind here in the hope that it will allow us a better understanding of the problem. In order that we may ask better questions and hopefully perform better magic. Hives. The science of behavioral biology in particular has already let go of reductionism. Consider the bee. If one is to understand what a bee is, the temptation for the reductionist would be to take a bee and put it in a laboratory environment. The bee would be prodded, pulled, given a bunch of tests, and eventually dissected in order to find out what the bee can and can't do, how it came to be, and what it is made of. The problem with this is that the bee did not evolve in a clean, Spartan laboratory. That's just the place that is most ideal for scientists to do their testing. The bee, as an individual being, isn't really where the nature of being a bee ends. Though a single bee seems at first like a simple thing, incapable of living for very long on its own, the hive of bees is something much more complex and capable. The hive lives on a higher level of abstraction, unbound from a single body, allowing it to interact with its environment and solve problems to a much higher degree of complexity. The hive as a nest is necessary for the bee's long-term survival and should therefore be considered as an extension of their organism. Note that while human beings and many other creatures reproduce in pairs of individuals, bees reproduce as a hive, normally having only one queen. Therefore, each bee is something more akin to an organ serving the nature and the will of the hive rather than a truly separate individual entity. Like other creatures, bees are in a constant feedback loop with their environment, which is rife with other organisms, all so interconnected in their interactions that it is very hard to fully understand all the ways in which one is affecting the other. This is particularly noteworthy in bees' symbiosis with flowers. Studies show that bees operate frequently on this group level and are capable of perceiving the world symbolically. We can tell this by scientific studies of bee dances. The cutely named waggle dance of a bee can communicate the location of a nectar source by representing the distance and the direction via the direction of the sun in relation to the hive. Not only are the sun and flowers' locations represented symbolically by the angle of the bee's dance, but it has also been shown that individual bees get better at interpreting the dances the more they observe them. The bees teach each other as if by a form of language. This shows us that the hive is not merely an emergent quality of a complex of robotic bee bodies, but a feedback loop between multiple elements from the physical to the social. Waggle dances appear to be a form of proto-language and show that the bees are capable of at least a basic level of abstract thinking. Abstract thinking has previously been mistaken as a type of perception that only humans or a few higher mammals and birds are capable of. If bees are capable of it, then perhaps all creatures are able to do it to some degree. If we were to compare this hive/body dichotomy to humans, one will see that we have different levels of existence at different layers of organization. From here, I will start with parts of the body and the colony of life forms that live in us and work upwards to the mind. The body is a colony. While it is often useful to think of your body as a single you, it is also a colony of independent life forms. Many of these parts of the greater you are also capable of independent action and treat your body as their environment. We depend on a complex colony of bacteria which reside primarily in our guts to digest our food. Modern medical science now shows us that these bacteria have a strong effect on our overall behavior and mood, and therefore influence our conceptual, social, and emotional world. Gut bacteria are responsible for the production of serotonin, a vital chemical for brain function, and mental health. On a nervous system level, our brain, brainstem, spinal cord, and the nerves that branch out along our bodies all behave as an interconnected system. Some of our reflexes, such as the time-old hammer to the knee test that doctors sometimes perform, don't require the brain at all, but are triggered from the spinal cord. Does this mean that the spinal cord must be considered part of the brain? To complicate matters further, humans have a second, less understood neural center in our gastrointestinal tract. Called the enteric nervous system, and sometimes referred to as the second brain, this nerve cluster has roughly 500 million neurons. More powerful than the spinal cord, which has about 100 million neurons, but less powerful than the cranial brain, which has about 86 billion neurons. We are not fully aware of the function of the enteric nervous system. However, we know it is capable of functioning independently from the main brain and brainstem. The enteric nervous system is deeply wired into the larger brain via the vagus nerve and prevertebral ganglia. It seems that this gut brain might be necessary for some automatic and subconscious processes. As we make new discoveries, the idea that we have only one brain and that it is alone responsible for our consciousness becomes more distant. It has recently been discovered that the heart also contains neurons and does some of its own neural processing. Perhaps these discoveries will continue until we are forced to treat most of the body as a thinking extension of the brain. At the very least, the idea that our personhood can be contained entirely within the cranium must now be put to rest. The transhumanist dream of becoming bodiless and immortal by having their brains uploaded to computers may be dashed by the necessity of also modeling the human body in order to function, and perhaps many of the restrictions that a body brings with it. Embodied cognition and inactivism. The following is a quote from Alva Noy, the professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. If you'd like all the references, please purchase a copy of my book. Quote, "One of the problems in the contemporary neuroscientific study of consciousness, I think, is really a sort of a basic fundamental one, which is that we've been looking for consciousness in the wrong place. We've been looking for it inside of us. For me, that's a profound mistake. That's a bit like trying to find the dancing in the musculature of the dancer, or trying to find the value of money in the chemical composition of the dollar bill. It's the wrong kind of place to look. The idea I've had in my work is that instead of thinking of consciousness as something that happens within us, in our brains or anywhere else, why don't we try and think of consciousness as something that we do, or enact, or perform in our dynamic involvement with the world around us?" End quote. Here I will summarize two related philosophical theories that look beyond the brain to explain cognition. The first is embodied cognition, a theory which purports that any full understanding of the human brain should also take into account its relationship with the rest of the body. The second is inactivism, the idea that much of our cognition arises from an interaction with our environment rather than entirely in the brain. Whatever aids you in solving a problem can be thought of as part of the cognitive process. Because we have been told so often that our brains are us, and that all cognition happens within our brains, at first it seems hard to swallow that part of our cognition could take place outside of the body. Perhaps the first hurdle for many is the common metaphor of an environment as a backdrop, like a stage set in a theatre, which is somehow separate from the actors. Instead, our environment is constantly negotiating itself with us, containing its own actors and actions. Our behavior in the world affirms our existence. If we push, the world pushes back. It is not usually necessary for the brain to contain a complete model of anything that we interact with. This includes our own bodies. The brain is already a very energy-thirsty organ, consuming about 20% of the energy required to fuel our entire bodies. When there is a way to conserve body energy, it can result in an evolutionary advantage. For this reason, we need only to store the amount of information in our brains required to interact with our environment. We do not need to model the parts of our environment that take care of themselves, which is to say, most of it. For this reason, much of our memory and perception consists of workarounds, shortcuts, heuristics, and hacks, rather than the maps, lists, or files one would expect to find in a computer. Solving problems in the environment often takes less cognition than trying to solve them entirely in your head. Consider working out a complex maths problem on paper compared with trying to keep track of all the terms in your memory. This offloading of cognition into the environment allows us to perform tasks that are much too complex for our brains alone. In 1986, an Australian roboticist, Rodney Brooks, conducted experiments to see if robots consisting of multiple modules could perform tasks without the use of representations, models, maps, or any unified operation. One of his robots in particular, named Herbert, proved this was possible. Herbert was designed to move around the laboratory collecting Coke cans. It did this despite not being able to maintain any internal processing for longer than 3 seconds. Furthermore, there was no communication between any of Herbert's separate modules. Each behaved like a separate robot. One set of sensors allowed it to avoid obstacles such as walls. Another allowed a mechanical arm to position itself in relation to a can. A mechanical hand made a grasping motion when it was in a particular position in relation to the arm, and so forth. By a clever chaining of completely separate functions, Herbert was able to collect the Coke cans despite having no unified program to do so. And that was from an experiment by Simons, 2009. If you'd like the complete references, please purchase the book. Brooks' idea, named subsumption architecture, became influential in robotics, theories of intelligence, and embodied cognition. If a robot can complete complex tasks that arise out of separate chained functions, perhaps life forms, including human beings, sometimes exploit this approach also. The following is a quote from the aforementioned study. Kirsch, 1995, provides a classification of ways in which humans arrange objects and features of their environment in ways that can help them compensate for the limitations of their relatively limited cognitive resources. In Kirsch's scheme, we use the spatial arrangement of objects in order to regulate certain task choices, to simplify perception, and to simplify internal computation. By initially gathering all the ingredients one wants to put in a salad near the sink, one thereby simplifies subsequent task choices. This provides a visual cue concerning which items are to be used and what is to be done with them. Moving the washed items over to the knife and cutting board indicates what is to be done next. In stacking spare pieces of wood appropriately, a carpenter can facilitate the later choice of pieces for use in protecting the workpiece when clamping and hammering. In working around a sink with a garbage disposal unit, it is often convenient to block the drain opening to prevent something from falling into the unit. This spares the user having to choose a safe place to put an object that might fall into the unit. These are the cases in which the use of space facilitates certain task choices. End quote. If we are a mind-body system, it is incorrect to frame the environment as something completely separate from us. Much of what we like to think of as our mind is an interaction with our environment. This is one of the reasons it is so hard for many people to understand how minds relate to brains. Our cognition contains so many shortcuts that we are forever cut off from any pure reality, including much of our own nature and the workings of our own bodies. We simply never evolved with the end goal of understanding ourselves. A person needs only to store instructions with which to skillfully manipulate a tool, rather than storing a model of the tool. The tool does what it does. We do not need to understand every aspect of its makeup in order to use it. We need only to respond to feedback, such as the sensation of operating a hammer, and react accordingly. Writing things down helps us think, as does talking a concept through. Many of us have realized that when we try and teach something to another person, we end up learning it better ourselves. The interaction with the person helps us order our thoughts. Enactivist theory holds that this external interaction with the environment should be considered part of your cognition. External tools like shopping lists, notes, computers, and calculators free up short-term memory. Given that we have a very limited short-term memory, the cognitive boost acquired by memory aids, such as writing, is enormous. Furthermore, the world of ideas is as much part of our environment as the physical world. For instance, a human being who lacks language is going to be severely restricted in how they can operate in the world where language is pervasive. It is here especially that the extended mind and enactivist ideas start to converge with magic and magical thinking. Magical rituals will frequently alter the environment on purpose to alter perception towards particular outcomes. We can see this going on with theatre, musical performances, and religious rituals such as Catholic Mass. Put simply, an individual, their mind, their environment, and their social sphere are so interconnected that it's not fully possible to say where one ends and the other starts. social and cultural realms. Just as the bee has evolved to be part of a hive, so the human being has evolved to be part of a social sphere. Small group relationships with other human beings or animals such as livestock and pets. This social sphere interaction is almost always necessary for finding a mate, and therefore must be treated in evolutionary terms as real. Awkward or crass people often find their social opportunities diminished. Charming people often find them increased. Already we have a sphere of reality where interactions such as charm and persuasion have a profound effect. Charm and persuasion are, of course, a huge part of magic. At a body level, humans reproduce through sex. But at a social level, as we have discussed with Dawkins' meme theory, we also reproduce through ideas. Above the social level is the vast network of social groups that we call culture. Here we find categories of action and identity such as art, music, tradition, and social hierarchy. All of these have a profound influence on the individual and their opportunities to act. These non-physical influences are so fundamental to being a human being that it might not make sense to speak of a self without other people, let alone without a physical environment. So let us lay out clearly what this tells us. Point 1. Your consciousness is not a thing, nor is it in your head. It is a process constantly reaching out into the environment and affirming itself. Human consciousness requires a brain and an environment to interact with. Part of that environment is a network of other brains doing the same thing. Point 2. You are in constant process with your environment, and it's that process that creates the feeling of you. Your selfhood is developed amongst other people. You are a collection of roles, and these roles are regularly in negotiation with others. Point 3. Your memories, as we have discussed in an earlier chapter, are only kept in a lossy way in your brain. You can only store enough information so that they can be recomposed when you get stimulus from the outside. Your self-awareness requires these constant triggers. Without them, we lose the keys to access many memories. Because of this, it is not a given that a brain raised in a vat without feedback from the senses or a body would be conscious at all. Point 4. The environment is not merely a bunch of objects. The environment, considered properly, happens at every level you can perceive patterns at. At the tangible level, the material level, the individual level, the social level, the societal level, the moral level, the cultural level, the ideological level, and the spiritual level. Learning new fields of study opens up new conceptual environments. All human environments involve symbolism, and our relationship to symbols can be manipulated through magic. Point 5. We are constantly negotiating what we can and can't do with the environment. What we can do in large part determines who we are. Changing the environment changes us. Because we don't ever take in the world all at once, even shifting our perception of our environment can radically affect our opportunities to act. If magic is the ability to manipulate the perception in accordance with the will, then acts of magic can also radically affect who we are. Ideas can change the way we perceive and interact with objects. The abstract is in a constant interaction with the concrete. And therefore, magic and magical thinking are not only unavoidable, but present us with powerful tools to alter reality as we understand it. Ideas form the self as much as bodies do. Environments are as necessary as brains, and social environments are just as formative to us as physical environments. For all these reasons, it does not make sense to restrict all that you consider to be you to the functions of your brain. For the same reason, hardline materialism is not a tenable position for an effective magician. In the next chapter, I will take a break from the neuroscience and discuss some common ways that magic affects us day to day. If you have enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. And you may wish to purchase a copy of my book, and you can find the links to do so in the video description.